Hello and welcome back to another episode of Definitive Analysis. And I'm excited today because we're going to be covering Foster Your Debt, a short story, pretty well known, I think a fairly widely read, I would say, short story from Philip K. Dick, who really I think is one of the best writers I've ever encountered. I've read so much of his work, and he has with a lot of these science fiction writers, there's just such an abundance of their material, right? They published so much, that pulp, coming out of that pulp generation, and there's just a lot to dig into. And this is a great story, Foster Your Debt. One thing, I just got done teaching this with my 9th graders, so I tend to cover this story 9th grade, but really I think I'm going to hand it off to my AP students as well and let them just read it and maybe, think about it a little bit, because it's so relevant. What we have here, just some of the context of this story, and then I'll get right into it, is kind of that holiday season, right? And also as it correlates to the buying season, right? Everybody going out, being encouraged through media and advertisements and marketing to go out and spend hard-earned money. And that's the one thing I want to start with here, right? Is we're at school. That's another reason I love to teach this story with high school is it's younger people, right? It's a younger protagonist, and it's right around the age of those students. And we're at school, but one thing we notice right away is they're all working, right? One thing this story seems to really subtly emphasize is that people work. We are a working class society, and that really goes all the way from like the business, people working in business, perhaps big business, definitely small business. We have the father as a small business owner in this story, and then just kind of your more standard workers going off into offices and factories, right? But the one thing that these people have in common, which is true of this story and true of today, right, year 2023 here, is that people are always working, right? We're very accustomed to this. And so we start at school. A couple things to take note of right off the bat. The title, Foster Your Debt. Philip K. Dick is very purposefully using names here, right? Both first and last, but especially last. Foster translates to forester, somebody of the forest, somebody of the woods. And that really takes us back into like pretty ancient times, right? People living in the forest, making do in the forest. Can be a quite treacherous environment, but also a resource-laden environment as well. But we think about the people that have been living in these environments. Another thing you want to take note of right away is the name Michael, which is the Archangel Michael, which is the strongest, most devoted angel to God in heaven. So it speaks to that strong connection to God. It's also, I think, that you get the rhetorical question, whose power is greater than God's, which is nobody's, right? You can't match that entity. So it speaks to the power of that, and perhaps in contrast to other things that are so tempting in our world, especially material things, right? Which can sometimes be a false idol, right? Compared to these notions of God, right? And devotion. And kind of, I guess you call it dogma, right? And kind of the dogma associated with that. Last thing to note here, gnats, right? Gnats. One thing we do with science fiction, every time you pick up a science fiction story is you have to do a little world building, because the world is obviously quite different than what our world is, right? But could also be similar. But here in this story, we have drones. Now that's one thing I've noticed about this story. I've been teaching it over the years, and over the years, 5-10 years, drone technology has definitely picked up, right? Increased, expanded, the technology's gotten better. So Philip K. Dick is one of those authors known for writing predictive science fiction. He's predicting things in stories that he was writing in the 70s and those decades, 60s, 70s. And I think he nailed it here, because all we see, and this isn't our society, ... yet. It is in some ways. When we think about mass surveillance, we have cameras everywhere. Now people have cameras everywhere on their own, right? These rings, we're surrounded by rings, things in public. We are being monitored. This is, in the story, a defense kind of feature, right? Where we have all these drones looking for incoming missiles. maybe the technology doesn't hold up too much in Philip K. Dick's mind compared to where we're at nowadays, where there's such sophisticated weapon detection technology, right, that I couldn't even get into it. But it is this idea of defense. Now, Gnats is interesting because it also reminds us of, and we get this a lot in this story, where the technological will become more like organic, natural kind of things, and then the people will become, and the natural beings will become more technologically kind of related here. So we do this interesting crisscrossing here in this story. And what gnats actually reminds us of is gnats, G-N-A-T-S, which are those little tiny bugs, which kind of are annoying and more of a nuisance. And the word that goes along with that understanding of gnats, these things in the sky, these drones, is the word lazily. It contrasts. So you see a lot of contrast. You're going to see a lot of oxymoronic language in this story. I think that's his intention, is to contradictions are simply things are not always what they seem, right? Then that's what it is. Whenever we encounter this idea of a contradiction, you can see it a lot in the story. If these are defense drones, why are we getting the adverb lazily, right? Circling lazily. They should be alert. We should get some much different kind of description there, right? But we get the word lazily. So keep that in mind right off the bat. There's this massive contradiction in terms of the defense that's in place versus more or less kind of the behavior we're seeing with that defense. Moving on, we have the teacher, Mrs. Cummings. The meaning of this name, without question, you go on the internet and you look up the meaning of this name, is bent or crooked. And, you know, I don't know what to make of that right off the bat, right? So we'll keep that one up in the air. I think you do see some contrast in the story, ongoing contrast between this idea of bent, crooked, twisted, and then maybe straight, right? Just kind of relatively straight lines, right? Or things described in that way. So there is a contrast there. What do we know that, this is where the story immediately strikes you as odd, because we see he's in school and we all know the things that kids normally do in grade school, right? Whether it be elementary, middle, right? In this case, it would probably be like a middle school. They're making weapons, and they're making really dangerous weapons, right? Mike is working on a blade, and his teacher says you've over sharpened it, right? You're going to need something much thicker, right? Something much thicker. So they're teaching them, just on a literal level, they're teaching them how to make these weapons, and it strikes us as odd right off the bat, right? They also highlight this idea, the teacher, Mrs. Cummings, digging day. And you're going to see that motif a lot throughout this story, the idea of digging, having to go underneath. And I think the animal that it's going to be likened to here, kind of right off the bat, is the gopher, right? When you think about those types of animals that find their safety, their salvation, right, in this idea of digging, right, and trying to get away from the surface where so much is taking place. People essentially are going to have to take on those same ideas here, right, digging underneath in order to find some kind of safety from the world they live in. All right. Another word or idea that Cummings relates to is chieftain. A chieftain of a village, a chieftain of a town, right? Somebody who takes on that level of responsibility. It also says sometimes cleric, monk. So we think of the role, that this woman is taking on as the teacher. And she says it. And this is where we really want to have that idea of the gopher, especially the color brown. That's what's going to show up with all of these things that represent that aspect of digging, right? To find our safety and our salvation. It's the gopher, right? The brown gopher. And it says right here, the gopher knows he'll find something valuable down there under the surface of the ground, right? Once the war picks up and bombs just start dropping, chemicals, this story doesn't hold back in terms of the weapons that are being supposedly devised, right? It's like really to cause as much harm as possible. Chemical, illness, biological, right? All these things. And we know that countries work on these. Do they use them? Maybe from time to time, and then there's like an outrage, and then they put the Geneva kind of accords into place, and it's up to a country from there if they're going to keep violating these things. But in this particular world of this story, It's like a no-holds-barred kind of approach to it, right? The whole idea is, and we'll get this later, the wheels of progress of weaponry is it just keeps getting more sophisticated and dangerous and hard to defend yourself against, right? That's the whole thing. Moving on here. Now, I'll say this because there has been already, we're just on page 2 here, and there has been some, I think, evidence of this, and I always, say this with, on the most mature level possible, right, as we analyze these stories. But there does seem to be this idea of male genitalia, kind of penetration. We'll see how this makes sense a little bit later on, but you even get the word here. A few children grinned contemptuously at him, but nothing penetrated his haze of wretchedness. And there's actually 2 big ideas here, I think. There's the penetration, right, which means like an invasion, a corruption of something, right, that was once fine and pure, right, and now it's been affected. And the other word I think is majorly important here is wretched, because it's so biblical, right? We talk about the wretched populations of this world that have had to endure, and also endure in silence, right? There's so much to be said of this state of wretchedness. I think it's one of the biggest ideas that Philip K. Dick is kind of lending us in this story, right? Making us think about. Wretchedness is also like, it's not only your life is miserable, but there's no way out of it. So there's no clamoring. I guess you just accept it, right? There's this passivity toward it. And that's a state of wretchedness as well. So it's not just what your conditions are, but your feelings about those conditions as well. And we have nothing, I think, right? Especially biblically speaking, when you go back to the old days of kind of poverty, the virtues of poverty, there's a lot of sympathy, right, to be had for people living in these wretched conditions. And we see it described for Mike. You're going to see it described for his father as well, right? Both of them have this wretchedness. This word pops up time and time again in the story, all right? And for Mike here early in the story, I'll just say it and move on. The wretchedness comes from not having a bomb shelter, not having that security. So that if this stuff people keep talking about does happen, I will have no escape from it, right? And this makes him terrified and morbid. He's just already giving up on life because, with that thought in mind. Mrs. Cummings' tired lips twisted angrily. And the word twisted is what I want to emphasize there. So you see that the name itself is bent and crooked, the twistedness, right, of her lips here. But on a brighter note, she sees the real fear in Mike's eyes, right? Mike is in such a wretched state that I think he does gain sympathy from Mrs. Cummings here. Bill O'Neill, the salesman, I think has a real strong sympathy for him. So we keep that in mind, and it comes out here, right? She says, "What's wrong? Don't you feel well?" And then she says, go down to Miss Groves. Groves is an interesting name to give us here. Not that Miss Groves is too big of a character in this story, but Groves is like a set of trees, a small cluster of trees, right? Is Grove. And so it reminds us of nature, and it reminds us of Mike's last name, Foster, right? Of the forest. And of the forest is very much going to conflict with of technology and machinery and now, and that's why I think this story is so relevant, because he was already predicting some of these aspects of our life. The AI, right? That's starting to become more of the norm here and encroach upon traditional ways of living, right? And what's available, I guess you could say, in our society. All right, very good. So he's going to go down to Miss Groves. Notice the way that Mrs. Cummings talks to him. If you're not functioning properly, Miss Groves will be glad to optium you, right? And I don't even think optium is quite a word. I think he's turning that into kind of a verb here. But notice that's more like you're discussing machinery, right? Functioning properly, like our computer on a Monday morning when it's not working, right? And we really need this thing to work. That's what you see in the story. It kind of crisscrosses. The people become described more like machines, or at least kind of regarded in that way. And the machines will be described more like organic, natural life, right? And we see that crisscrossing take place. Moving on. This is where some of just the context starts to get plugged in. What makes it so hard for Mike? His dad doesn't contribute to the civic defense, keeping the gnats up in the sky, the bomb shelters, the cheaper public bomb shelters in place. And one thing he definitely ain't gonna do is shell out the ridiculous amount of money for a bomb shelter, right? Which I think if we take a step back in terms of narrative writing and science fiction, whatever, even in the world of science fiction, it's so ludicrous, right? Compared to the world we live in nowadays, where you got to worry about a bomb shelter in your backyard. We're not quite there. Some people maybe the super wealthy, bet your butts they probably got some bomb shelters ready to go, right? I don't. In fact, what I relate to in this story is more on the other level before it jumps to that kind of almost that point of absurdity, but an interesting point, this idea of bomb shelters, is like dishwashers, right? There you go. I just bought a what's the name? Bosch dishwasher. It's like a really good, German brand, and I feel pretty amazing about that, right? And like, ooh, look at this, look at my new dishwasher. So I can relate to that, but this story I just want to mention is taking that to a whole nother level, this idea of a bomb shelter, right? A souped up bomb shelter in your backyard because of the apparent, quote unquote, apparent need for it, right? Based on the world conditions and the war that's impending. All right, very good. Moving on here, that's the big thing. His dad does not contribute. He's not buying into this. He's not purchasing any of this stuff. And he's known as an anti-P. And just for the sake of everything, there's no spoilers here. Anti-P will stand for anti-preparedness, not feeling the need to be prepared for war, right? And buying all of these things and giving into these funds, right? Paying into these funds that keeps up this whole idea of defense. And we'll get more on that as the story progresses. Mrs. Cummings can't believe he doesn't have a shelter. Now, this is an interesting language. A strange feeling filled the woman. And I think when we get into the bomb shelter, one of the major metaphors we see, the symbols of that bomb shelter, is going to be, I think, and it's not always easy to see all this, but the woman's womb, right? A woman's womb, where the child begins, right? Basically, right? And a strange feeling filled the woman. And she's even given Mrs., so we know that she is a wife, potentially a mother, right? Mrs. Cummings here. But this idea of birth, right, gets us thinking. And, just on a thematic level, that's always an interesting idea, right? When we talk about being in the womb, it really is, and it didn't dawn on me until reading the story, right, over the last few weeks with my students, last couple weeks. It's the safest place you'll ever know, especially once you enter into this world and you just see the dangers that loom, the multiple dangers, not just like personal dangers, but the existential dangers too, including nuclear war, right, and these things that could end our lives in an instant, right, change everything. And we just hope that these things never happen. But there it is, right back in the womb, where we feel that immense protection. We have everything we need. We're attached to the umbilical cord, right? And it's really just I think this very warm, safe place. That is why, many of us probably already know this, when you are delivered into the world, whether it be vaginal or C-section, you are crying your eyes out, right? No baby comes into this world not crying. I think it's pretty rare because you've been ripped from that incredibly pleasant sanctuary. And that's what we think of when we think of the bomb shelter here as well, right? The need for this bomb shelter, a place of safety, abundance, right? A certain warmth, maybe a strange warmth when we think about the idea that it's a bomb shelter and it's filled with so much grandeur. But then again, wasn't that growing up in the womb? Wasn't that being nourished in the womb where we had everything we ever needed, right, to grow, right, and develop? So keeping us aware of that right off the bat. And I think this is the first, really the part where that whole idea is set. A strange feeling filled the woman. We get ready for this idea of a kind of conception and then a development. When you think of Mike crouched in a bomb shelter, knees to his chest, you think of a fetus, right, inside the womb. Moving on here. One thing that's very interesting about the children who are kind of, talking about Mike, right, in the classroom here. He doesn't have a bomb shelter. His father doesn't do this. They're all doing it in very mild, dull voices. So they're not going out of their way, oh my gosh, and having this outrage. They're just saying it very mildly and dully, almost in this boring kind of way, right? The teacher, it says, in her dull scholastic way. Scholastic means like education, academic. It could be this idea that, you know, sometimes teachers are so caught up in that side of teaching, the academic, that they forget about the other aspects of their students' lives that matter as well, like they don't have a lot of money, or how they're struggling through situations, or whatever it could be. She starts to see Mike on a different level, and I think that's part of the story. That's part of the themes here, is starting to have that empathy for other people, right? And not just feeling like you have to look at people based on what kind of student they are, or in the workplace, what kind of worker they are, right? And we only look at people in this kind of way. It really hard. It's the holiday season. Maybe Philip K. Dick had this in mind. It reminds us of like A Christmas Carol with Scrooge, Ebenezer Scrooge, who has to start seeing the people around him for like their personal sides and their loving nature, and that changes his business mindset, right? Of always just looking at people as employees, and I'm making as much, you know, doing what I got to do. It kind of slows him down, and she's going to experience the same thing here. And I think the salesman, especially Bill, will experience the same thing as well. Starting to see this child for Mike for something else other than just a customer, right? Or a student. Okay, very good. Maybe something much needed for this holiday season, right? As we go into this time of year. All right. Last thing, the calm demeanor of both the teacher and the students here as they talk about Mike's predicament reminds us of the laziness of the gnats in the sky, the drones in the sky, right? Everything just seems kind of kicked back, lazy, like not much of a urgency, right? Or anything going on here, right? We go into the next section, that the idea of workers is reinforced again. And I love the imagery. It's brief, but it's powerful, at least in my mind. This really cool like rocket coming down, commuter rockets. People are getting to where they need to go, perhaps even far away, extremely quick. It reminds us of like the bullet trains, the high-speed rail that could be coming to California. I live in California. Fairly soon, right? But quicker transportation. Here we have rockets, which is always nice to consider. But it's the idea of just people milling to and from work. I just have gone on break within the last couple days, and it feels amazing. I'm not like in the car, you know, commuting and going through the same routines and worker life, right? I live the worker life. I'm sure many of you out there either live it, maybe aspire to do it because that's where the salaries are, but there is kind of a humdrum, you know, dull nature to it, right? And that's what you see here in the beginning of this next section. But again, the last sentence, assuming the missiles came, all these gnats, all these very apparent defense measures that people are paying money for should remind you of our situation, right? And just to mention that, so much money goes to, in America, the military industrial complex via the Pentagon and contracts, and a lot of that money that we pay in taxes goes to the Pentagon. I think the majority of it. But there's not a real threat, assuming the missiles came. There is no certainty, right? All this money being spent for what? For doubt? But that's what it seems to amount to here, right? However, next paragraph, quote, a mechanical news machine shouted at him excitedly as he passed, end quote. Notice the excitement of the media. Notice the excitement of the news. What should this remind you of? Terrorism. Terrorism. Osama bin Laden. Terrorism. Terrorism. Notice the brilliance of having this term terrorism is that it is not linked to a specific country. So it can keep moving whenever you feel like you got to keep moving the target. It's a never-ending target, right? Terrorism. And we saw this a lot in the news, maybe for good reason, right? We go back to the attacks of 9/11 and things leading up to it and things that followed. Don't forget, why did we have those attacks? Because of U.S. involvement in the Middle East preceding that and the loss of innocent life, children, women, civilian men, right? hundreds of thousands, if not many, 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 many more, right? Which led to, and then after that, the U.S. retaliation in those countries, right? So it's obviously there's a lot that goes into it, right? We consider all these things. But they say nowadays, and maybe for the last like 5 or so years, I remember hearing this statistic, more people die of peanut allergies each year in America than terrorist attacks. So why such a buildup? Why such a military budget if we're not really seeing the real danger from all these things the media is screaming about? And notice that's what happens here, right? The news machines are everywhere. The screens with the news are everywhere, right? The propaganda, and that we finally kind of settled upon the term here. The propaganda is everywhere. Okay, moving on here. A lot of I'll be quick, but a good amount of writing is given to describe the public shelter. And it's also trying to advertise itself through the flashy, garish neon signs and all these things, but it has more of like a kind of subdued glow to it, right? So it's obviously not quite as fancy. And this is where we get into another big topic in the story, the idea of public versus the idea of private, right? There are public beaches, there are private beaches, there are public pools, you can have a private pool, and that's so nice, right? There are public vehicles, right? Some of us take public transportation or do like ride shares, and then of course there's private, right? So that's what it gets into here, right? The public versus this idea of the private. Other big ones to think about: post office, public; UPS, FedEx, private. And that private didn't exist until maybe, I don't even know, you tell me, 25 years ago? How long has UPS and FedEx been doing business here? Maybe a little bit longer than that. I really don't know. But when I was growing up, it was just the post office. There was really no other private entity at that point that dabbled in what used to be just a federally a mandated, I guess you could say, a service, right, that we used. Now we have all these private options. And I'll leave it up to you. Do you tend to like to go with things that are within the public sphere? Now we can get into ideas, I think it gets into ideas of like healthcare now, right? Because there's like public options now, right, with healthcare, even though, no, I shouldn't say that. I'm pretty sure I think it all still gets funneled through private industries. But that could be changing. That's what some Americans want, is a public healthcare option, in contrast to just all the private industries that are giving us healthcare, right? So this is such a big topic, right? And he's dealing with it right here in this paragraph. The only kind of weird thing is we notice it costs money to get into the public bomb shelter. You look at the history of public state schools across America. At one point, not anymore, because they have to make some money, but I think at one point, correct me if I'm wrong, they were free. Absolutely free for the most part, right? Free. Now, look at private schools. Private schools tend to be way more expensive, right? Or considerably more expensive than public schools. So another thing to think about. But notice here in this story, it's still 50 cents, which I think for us, 2023, I don't know what the inflation, you got to translate that to, but who knows, maybe a few bucks, right? But it's still this idea that you have to pay for something that is public. Private, no question. You're paying for the private because there's things that come with that. But the public, shouldn't it be free? I'll leave that up to you. Here's where we get the features of the bomb shelter. Not much to say there, except that it seems to give you everything, provide everything, much like the womb that we find ourselves in the very, very utter beginnings of our lives, right? And just providing everything, including the safety. Trapped. Imagine you brought into this world filled with so much cruelty and malice and difficulty and sadness, etc., etc. And countries that want to destroy each other. It's enough to drive you crazy. And here we are, right? But in that womb, much like this bomb shelter, you are completely cut off. And don't we all wish we could go back to something like that, right? I mean, in some thematic way at least. The salesman. I love how the salesman, this is Bill O'Neill. He's kind of I would say a big minor character for this story, because he is what his name suggests, and I'll get to that later. But what I want to say here is he's just the salesman. When this kid's in the store, he's in salesman's mode. Some of you might have had jobs like this, where like you can't let people just touch things, you can't let people get free samples all the time, right, etc., etc. You're trying to bring in money in business, and that's the mindset that he's on. But remember the teacher who only thinks scholastically. You're going to cut off a total understanding of that person on some other level, maybe more important level than the level that you're looking at them on here. Just a customer. Quote, they wasted time, they broke things, they pilfered, which means steal. Small stuff when nobody was looking. Think about that attitude he has toward Mike and people like him in the bomb shelter store, right? Think about that attitude, and then think about general attitudes toward poor people in our country, right? They're not to be trusted. They're only going to do bad things. You know, that's the attitude. You know, people who don't have the money to buy something, whether it be a property, whether it be something smaller, aren't to be trusted because they steal, aren't to be trusted because they break things, right? Moving on, he's still in business mindset. We'll give him a good trade-in on his old one, allowing for depreciation and obsolescence. Yeah, it's a crazy thing to say, you know, talking about depreciation and obsolescence as reasons. You know, we'll give him a little less money than he may want, because isn't it the companies themselves, in simply producing the products in the ways that they produce them, it is planned obsolescence. It is this kind of planned depreciation, right? As soon as you drive a new car off the lot, it's already depreciated a ton of what it was just worth. Cars are the worst when it comes to that. Homes are probably the best, right? Homes usually grow in value, especially in California, or at least retain value. Cars don't even retain value, right? They go down immediately. So they're acting like they're doing them a favor, but it's almost like they caused that problem in the first place, or at least that's my way of seeing that. Now Mike starts to open up. My father says all this crap is a waste of money, right? You're just trying to scare us into buying things that we don't need. And boom, scare us into buying things that we don't need is the whole mantra of marketing and advertising, right? That's what they prey on, is people's vulnerabilities, what we feel ashamed about, what we feel scared about, what we feel worried about, and then they offer the solution in terms of some product that might be okay, that might suck. It all just depends. But the whole point is to make you feel scared so that you have to buy something. And in this story, we talk about the absurd example of a bomb shelter, right? That's the whole idea of bombs, right? And having to shield yourself from these things is already frightening. This is just on a more general advertising level. Make people feel ugly. Make people feel like their brain is not so strong, right? Or quick enough, right? And offer them some solutions to that. Make them feel like their house doesn't have the certain things that it needs, that it's missing out on some really essential products, right? But you make people feel incomplete, vulnerable, even afraid, and then they'll buy your products, right? It really is marketing 101, right? That's like advertising 101. All right, last thing I'll say about Bill O'Neill here, because he kind of disappears for a while after the scene, is he's, you know, in the beginning, he's very much in that business mindset, even saying, we're not going to mark it down as a demonstration model. We've got roped into that too often. So we're not going to lose any profits here, right? We are totally in it for ourselves. There's that kind of insidiousness to it, there's that envidiousness to it. And yeah, it's just, we only have ourselves in mind here. Like Mike elaborates just a little bit more, and he really, you know, when we get this elaboration, it feels like it's just, yeah, it's kind of the way that it worked out. But he basically says, yeah, you can keep turning out like appliances, right? And then people finally buy enough of those things, right? You only need so many TVs in your house. You only need so many dishwashers, that's for sure, one, right? So once you got it, you're done. But if we keep this notion of defense alive, right, that you have to now start buying things for your own defense, kind of crazy for us because we don't live in a society like this. We have National Guard, we have taxes. So yes, our taxes go to hopefully defend ourselves. I'll leave that up to you whether you think America is well defended, right? I'll leave that up to you. I don't know enough about it in terms of domestic, right, kind of protections here. That's why we have National Guard, right? So we have some things that can snap into action if needed here, right? But that's ongoing, and that's where the companies found their magic, is that they know you don't only need so many dishwashers and TVs and such, but with the defense stuff, it's now about your real acute safety, and you're going to be willing to spend anything, right? And the dad essentially believes he has this figured out, and he doesn't want to buy into this stuff. And I guess it's a free enough society where at least you in the story, where at least you can make that decision and you can refrain from paying, which is interesting, because in many ways, that's the craziness of our society, is we can't refrain from paying. Our taxes are literally taken out of our paychecks right before we even get them. And if you're in business, you're heavily audited, right, to make sure that that's taking place, right? So the absurdity is, at least in this story, they have the freedom. In our society, we don't even have the freedom, right? It comes right out of our paychecks, and then the taxes go to the military-industrial complex, and they spend it on war, right? They spend it on war. So it's even more absurd in our own society, and I just thought of that. It kind of freaks me out a little bit, but what are you going to do? It's just a certainty of our situation. At the very end, even the salesman says it. Mike's so worried about a war. He's so worried about his impending death. He won't have the protection he needs in the final moment. And then Bill even says, maybe there won't be a war. And there we're constantly reminded of the questionable nature of all of this, right? Will it even happen? How many people die each year of terrorist attacks? Less than people who die from peanut allergies, which is already a pretty small number. So why are we seeing such a roaring from the media and the news about these things, right, is the idea. Moving on. We get the title. We get the reference to the title here, and it's coming from the physical education coach at his school. Foster, the coach said angrily, "You're dead." And I think what's important to note here is the anger, right? We see a lot of anger. It comes from the father. It comes from Mike himself. It comes from even Bill and Al, the two salesmen. We see a lot of anger. And so to know that this whole foster, you're dead, could be taken a few ways. One is, foster, you're not strong enough in this world. You don't have what you need. You're not wealthy enough. You don't have what you need. You're gonna die, right? And saying this in an angry tone. More symbolically, foster, you're dead is people of the forest, right? People who live these older, more traditional lives, perhaps. You're dead. Your time is over. The era of that way of thinking has come to an end. So there could be a couple ways you look at this. But on a literal level, he's just worried about not being able to hold his breath long enough, which I've never been able to really analyze that one too well, what that could represent. It's kind of a strangulation. You see this reference to a strangulation in Mike's voice a couple times, right? So obviously it kind of falls in line with that. But just worried about not having the air, right, and running out of air. I'm going to keep on going. We find out, and this is where the name makes perfect sense, what is the father's business? A wooden retail furniture store. So he's in a small business. It's another thing to think about. I'm not going to say much about it, but you know, from what I hear, our country is great for big business, but not so great for small business, right? Sometimes they like to give you the impression that it's just business all the way, but no, there's a distinction between the big business. Imagine like if I'm going to open up a TV shop and I'm going to sell TVs. Look at who I'm competing with. Best Buy, Target, Walmart. Pfft, good luck, right? How does small business even compete? So I just want to mention that. This is a small business, right? So the dad in a way is having a hard time, right? It's not some big successful business. He's just mom and pop shop. And the interesting thing here is wooden, which ties to the name forests, right? So I love that. I think it would make for some good artwork, right, for the story when you start to really incorporate that notion of natural landscapes, the forests, right? Because this is going to contrast with machinery and factories and AI and all that stuff. Moving on, the dad's arms are pale and thin, but muscular. There's contrast. There is so much contrast as we keep going with this story. And I think that speaks to working as well. He has a small business. It's up every day. at the work site, trying to manage his employees. It's anybody who knows small business owners knows it's kind of a nonstop thing, right? You live and breathe the store. I know a guy, right? He lives and breathes that store. Right? He's always there. And it's very much that worker mindset, right? Very astute, very consistent, right? Doing what you have to do to keep that business afloat. The dad snorts, reminds us of the kind of animal nature of him, right? I think early on here. You see that Mike hands his coat to a hanger and the hanger does the rest of the job. So it's one of those first indications that, aside from some of the other stuff like the rocket ships and stuff, this is an advanced society, right? More advanced than what I'm looking at here around me right now. Far more advanced. So advanced there's a hanger that you just like throw your coat to it and it takes it and it brings it to the closet for you, right? I could use a hanger like that. That'd be pretty cool. But it also shows that like it's just doing more of the work for us. It reminds you of the movie WALL-E. If you've never seen WALL-E, please go see WALL-E, right? It's my favorite Pixar film, I think, or animated film. Because I think the themes are so pressing, right? Where we just now give up on our responsibilities in this world, right? And just let machines take over. But what that means for us, the results of that. This is where you get more of it. His father, he's talking about like the new models. This is like cars. The 2024s are already out and the 2023s are still there on the lot with high prices. Like, what are we doing here, right? It's just to encourage everyone to get the new. Now they have smartphone programs where you pay like less than $100 a month, a little less, and you're going to get a new iPhone every year. You get the newest iPhone. You just trade in the old one, get the new one for just an increased fee on your monthly bill or something, right? Because people want the new all the time. The dad hates it. The dad can't stand this, right? And it says his father, quote, his father threw down his fork savagely. The table caught and absorbed it. Two things savagely. Animals, right? He is an animal in this moment. But notice what the table does. The table has AI equipped in it, not like this one, which is a wood table, right? This is, maybe I got this from Bob Foster. Maybe I did. But it actually moves to absorb all of the plates that he disturbed, right? So the table itself has moved around to make sure it's collecting all these plates. But more importantly, I think what it's doing is it's absorbing that human anger, right? And maybe it's the way that we train AI ourselves, right, in our daily lives and the uses of our phone or otherwise. ChatGPT, please don't use ChatGPT, whatever. But it's absorbing the anger. It's absorbing that savagery, right? Maybe so that it can have it for itself and be able to demonstrate those propensities of who we are as people, maybe to avoid it, maybe just to get rid of it in the moment, right? To neutralize that savage anger that we are so capable of. But notice what that table is doing. I think it's a very interesting thing, right? The dad makes a couple good points. Interest. Anybody who watches this lecture knows interest. Not interest in terms of what you're interested in life. Like I like Legos, I like running, whatever. I like reading literature. Interest in terms of what collects on debt, credit card debt. Mortgages come equipped with interest, which eventually subsides, right? Whatever. But interest is a killer. I have only the required interest in my life. So I even avoided it on the newer car that we bought. So just on my mortgage, I have interest, nothing else. I pay my credit card off every month, no interest there. You don't want interest. Interest is money being created out of nowhere, right? For these companies to seize, right? And just make themselves more wealthy. It's crazy. And that's where it gets into like a certain kind of banking system that kind of supports that as well. But yeah, it's just, these companies want to sell you these things, but look at the downside, right? Look at the fine print, see everything that it's coming with. This all makes sense. I remember being on college campuses. Maybe I was a student at that time and, sign up for a credit card, get a cool t-shirt. And we're idiots. We're young people and we're like, wow, a cool t-shirt. And I get this thing where I can start loading up some money. And then maybe people that just work up such credit card debt that it ruins their credit. Credit's king. And they just have a very hard time. So the dad's pointing these things out. And notice, while it's on my mind, that's called guidance. That is called mentorship. And I hope to do the same thing for my 2 boys, right? To teach them, and my students in the classroom, we talk about this sometimes, the pitfalls of interest, right? And getting wound up in things that you can't really afford. And some students always tell me they wish that school did more of that, right? That kind of financial literacy stuff, because it's so important. And notice, it's so key, that that's what the dad is doing here, right? He's providing that kind of guidance to his son. Is Mike going to really take it to heart? We'll have to wait and see. He can't compete with the big chains. We just talked about that, right? And he says there ought to be a law. Love it. There really should be a law that prevents big businesses from having all kinds of advantages over small businesses. And I'll leave it up to you to look into that and do research on that, right? How unfair, how tilted is it in favor of big business in America today in the year 2023? I'd love to hear what you have to say, to be quite honest, what you find out. There ought to be a law. He's right. Maybe there ought to be a law, but there's not one, which tells you that the government's not really doing anything to fix these issues, right? The wife. This is on page 8, and this is the first time the wife really lays in and makes a point. And it's an interesting thing. She's angry too. The face is blazing, right? She doesn't like the fact that everybody talks about them not having a bomb shelter, not paying into the most basic of funds for the defense of this impending war. She hates it. Notice, this is key, she prioritizes the idea of not fitting in more than actual safety from an attack, right? For her, it's not about, we really need to be safe. It's about, I just want to fit in with everybody else. And that's when we're reminded of the kind of consumerism nature, consumerism aspects of this. Keeping up with the Joneses is the expression. Like, if they got that new Bosch dishwasher like I got, my neighbor sees this, I got to get a Bosch too, right? And keeping up with the Joneses here, or I see something that they have. So you get that idea, and I think this is all quite capitalistic. Like, you know, we got to mention that at the halfway point of the story. You got to mention that, right? That this is also, as a critique of big business and business in general, this is also a critique of, and I never even thought about that and highlighted this point. That's why I love this story so much, honestly. Notice we have big business, GE, with the 2 salesmen, versus small business, father, with the retail furniture business. And this is all AI infused, and this is just traditional, right? Like the desk I'm sitting at right now. And he can't compete with GE, especially with everyone pushing defense, 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 right? How can he compete? So I just wanted to mention that. Now Ruth, she's angry, but if you look up the meaning of the name Ruth, it actually means compassionate friend. And we'll look at that. Is she a friend to Bob throughout this story, or does she kind of turn on him? Here she's angry. We just talked about that, right? She wants to fit in. Bob says the main reason here, it's not just because I'm an anti-P, but maybe what kind of promotes that attitude is, he says it, I just can't afford it. I can't afford it. And then the wife retorts, and she says, but you're spending it all on the furniture store. And she gets angry, and she says, it says, quote, she slammed at the table and it leaped wildly to gather the empty dishes like a startled animal. It dashed furiously from the room and back into the kitchen, the dishes churning in its wash tank as it raced. This is quite the table. It's even got like a dishwasher inside of it, and it's moving around and it's grabbing things. It is absorbing that human anger that is coming from the need to fit in, that is coming from the need to feel, from the father's anger, right, of not wanting to have to give in to all of this. But notice what it's doing here. I just wanted to mention that. And it's becoming more organic. It's becoming more natural, leaping wildly, startled animal, right, is how it's being described here. Very good. One of the only references we get, I think, to really Archangel Michael is right here, and it's not really, and it's not a description of Mike's shoulders. It is a description of the father's, but it does make us think of Michael, Michael as in the Archangel Michael, and it says his shoulder blades like broken wings. So the dad does have these shoulder blades that look like they could harness wings, and the power of that majestic, godly force, godly, not materialistic. godly. Go back to the beginning of the story, right? But they're broken. Can they be repleted? Can they be, can they be replenished, right? Can those wings come back? Is Mike, who's actually given the name of Archangel Michael, can he be that new angel moving forward into this world? We're going to have to wait and see. End of that section, right? Moving right along. And I'm going to put a link to the online text so you can follow along at least with the pages that I have here if you feel the need. But page 9. And the living room is quiet, and it's because the TV is off. And our minds are quiet because the propaganda is off, right? So there's a nice correlation there. And Bob Foster, the dad, is laying on the couch, and he just seems like a very fatigued man here. And maybe based on the name, the forests, right, nature in general, maybe the world is feeling quite fatigued at this point. Who knows? Now, Mike loves to hear a story over and over. The day you met the president. Now, the name Bob is short for Robert, and Robert translates to bright fame or bright and famous, whatever you want to say. And I find it very interesting because he's just a small furniture store owner who barely is making ends meet. He doesn't feel like a very bright and famous person, but I think it's because of his run-in with the president. You could either just say the president is bright and famous, that's about as bright and famous as it gets, right? Or because Bob had this run-in with the president and he was able to kind of like have a back and forth with him, right? And maybe even make a point over the president, he's acquired this fame, right? This is his story. And this is his moment with somebody who's supposed to represent so much, right? The president, and he has the story to tell. And Mike loves to hear it, right? He even says every once in a while, I've told you 1,000,000 times, every once in a while since you were a baby, taking us back to just right after that fetal period, right, where we were so protected, and then right after that protection of the womb ends, here you're going to start to feel protected by notions of a president and the things that a president says and things that he represents, right, and that's going to provide a certain kind of safety for you, right? That could be the case. Once you're out of that womb, you're going to need something else to feel a sense of protection. Now, I love this. This is a great question when I'm in class to stop with students. It says, he looked about like he does in the vid screen, smaller though, right? So the president looks exactly, he's like, how did he look in real life? How did he look? He's like, he looked like he did on the TV, but smaller. And we ask, why smaller? And it could be a couple reasons. A smaller sense of power and influence in real life versus being on the majestic television, right, and having that kind of display, and also message. Sometimes when we watch people on TV, the message seems to be amplified in a way that when we meet them in real life, it doesn't really seem to translate on such a grand level, right, or powerful level. So I love that line. It gets us thinking. You know, you have to get this. Even in a minute too, it's going to talk about how the president was perspiring and sweating, and that could be it too. Like you see a real celebrity out there, right, maybe on the street, and they look a mess and they're sweating, and you're reminded they're human. Right? Just like the president here. He's just a human being, just like you and me, just like the dad. And maybe next to the dad here, the dad can retain because of his ideology. In fact, that's that idea of being bright and famous, even against somebody who's supposed to represent that idea so much, right? The president of the United States. But he's just a dude. He's just like anybody else. You see President Biden and President Trump years ago on TV. If you were to see him in real life, you probably maybe wouldn't have that same kind of a feeling toward these men, right? Could be. Moving on here, but we can read into that line in a nice analytical way there, right? Now, this is where it kind of hurts for the dad because it literally says, the narration, Mike's hero is the president. And it should make you think immediately about the father. The father's there to be a guide and a mentor. I hope to be this to my two boys every day of my life, right? Moving forward as they get older. And yet, it's the president, right? So that one hurts. Like, take a note on that. That one hurts for the father, right? Especially when you're trying to give your son what you feel is important information about the world. He just talks about how the country was no longer going to provide defense. And I want to point out that's so different than our country, right? We haven't been attacked in any kind of way Hopefully these things never happen. You never know. But the defense is not left up to us. I don't have to have like weaponry around my home and a bomb shelter in my backyard ready to go, right? If I wanted to, and we know like doomsday preppers and stuff, some people take this stuff serious and they really do these things. But that's what happens in this story. The government gives up on defense, and now it becomes a part of each district or town's responsibility. I live in Moore Park, California. It's like saying, all right, Moore Park, everyone's going to be, who lives in Moore Park is now going to be contributing to defenses, and you got to start paying for all this stuff. And Thousand Oaks and Chatsworth, and everyone, right, starts to do this. Or maybe on a larger level, like the San Fernando Valley starts to gear up for war, military defense. But that's what it's giving us in this story, right? That's why the president is making these rounds, touring the country to get people ready for that type of participation, right? And he brings them this big green flag, the preparedness flag. And this is supposed to make everybody feel safe, just like Mike, taken from the womb, now just a baby, almost like wrapped in the swaddle. That'd be another great picture of this green preparedness flag, right? This child, this fake sense of protection, because that's what the dad is going to do, right? The dad is going to poke holes in the president's whole idea here, right, of people providing defense for themselves, right? Just to give you a couple quotes from the father: TV sets and cars are good for something. You can only manufacture and sell so many of them, right? So now it's going to become bomb shelters, gas masks, right? All these things for military defense, right? Yeah, I mean, here's what the story gives us. I guess defense costs too much. I guess they save a lot of money, cut down the national debt by this. Maybe, right? We also go into a lot more national debt because of national defense or offense, however you want to perceive it, right? So kind of our world is worked out way differently in terms of kind of the design that Philip K. Dick had in mind here. This is really more to bring us back to that the idea of a feudal time period, like little fortresses, and you're going to get names that specifically reference this in just a moment. So really taking us back to like that older time period, I think, right? It's a great piece of the dialogue here, right? Shared with the president. The father says, sharing the story with Mike for the millionth time, I said to him, "Is that all you brought us? A strip of green cloth?" And there we see the powerful modes of propaganda, whether it be a flag or a strip of green cloth that is supposed to represent a collective sense of being protected and working toward a sense of protection, even though it's doing nothing. It's not providing real defense equipment for people, right? And paying for these things. It's just saying, you can do it. And this flag is a representation of that, right? So it's a great line to show the emptiness of this gesture, the propaganda of this moment, that you can be safe even though we provide you no means of safety, right? Instead, it's just in your head. And that's where the wretchedness kind of takes place as well, right? That state of wretchedness. It's in our minds as well. And instead, we're a lot of little separate towns, little walled forts, sliding and slipping back to the Middle Ages, raising up separate armies. That's what ends up happening in this particular context of America, right? In this science fiction story. The dad, Mike seems to hold on to this reverence for the president. They don't really get into too much more detail after that, but it's enough to defeat the father. And he feels resigned, and he says, how much is that bomb shelter, right? Maybe we can get a used one. And he says people buy, he's thinking maybe I'll be able to afford this thing. The big question is, why does he change his mind? That's the question I like to stop with my students and ask. He's been so adamant, anti-P up to this point. Why has he changed his mind? We usually say his son, right? To make his son feel protected. Perhaps to make his wife feel like she fits in. Maybe to satisfy both of those objectives, right? That could be it. He thinks he's going to be able to do this because people buy wood furniture for Christmas gifts, right? Which is interesting. That we're trying to get back in touch with something more natural, something more organic, on that day of Christ and what Christ represents, right? Because I think he chooses Christmas here for a very valid reason, right? To represent some of those aspects of Jesus Christ. We get the word desperate cheerfulness when the dad says, yeah, I'll buy this thing. Another, in one of the more prominent uses, I think, of oxymoron here, right? How could cheerfulness be desperate, right? Or is it even cheerful at that point any longer? And we're trying to understand that. The next section begins, and just like this, the snap of a finger, the bomb shelter is put in, it's covered up, they put flowers over it. Students have commented, it's always interesting about the flowers because that represents life and kind of, you know, a beautiful living that's taking place. And yet here we are with a bomb shelter underneath, which represents so much morbid possibility in the world that everything could end within just a moment. It's almost like a false sense of what's happening. Or is the bomb shelter, ironically, a false impression of what's really happening in the world? Remember, no bombs, the gnats are lazy in the sky, no incoming missiles. What's really the truth here? The world on top, where everything looks pleasant, green hills, beautiful, or the world on bottom, where there's so much preparation for war? Which one speaks to the truth? That's the question, right? That's the question. All right. They are, the workers who put this in, laborers, work, are wearing brown coats and they're digging, which means gophers, right? So we're reminded of that idea of gophers, right? In that new world, we're going to have to go deep like the gophers and find what we need. And in this way, they have found safety underneath, right? With this bomb shelter. They invite the neighbors over. It's Mrs. Carlisle. Carlisle literally translates to a small fortress, almost like a small castle, right? And this is great because the next line, it's Ruth Foster. They're just going back and forth, and Foster is of the forests. And I love this because it brings up this crucial topic, which is the people who can afford, based on money and position in life, in society, who can afford safety and security, those who live inside the castle walls, inside the fortress walls, and those who reside in the forest who are poorer. And it represents two classes of people. The haves, especially when it comes to security, right? And the have-nots, right? Those who reside elsewhere in the forests, where it's obviously probably a rougher and more dangerous way of living, right? Especially if you consider all the threats that are out there. In this, it makes us think of feudal times. I love it. It makes us think of, you know, the castles. I just bought one of my kids a castle Lego, right? So we look forward to putting that together because those are the ones I used to use growing up that I played with. So I'm excited for that, but I love this distinction of those who can afford protection and those who can't. Those who can afford a bomb shelter and those who can't. And Mike's family, his dad, his mom, they can't. And yet here they are desperate to do so, right? And they're going to do it. Interest payment plans, they're ready to take it on. What does this all lead to? Just like they don't know what to do with all this attention. The mom is filled with, I'll mention it, grim satisfaction. Again, oxymoronic language. He does it a lot here. How can satisfaction be grim? I guess it's not really satisfaction at that point, or what kind of satisfaction is it, right? If we were to put that into words. Also, gaunt frame. Who lives outside the castle walls? Gaunt people, right? Those who probably don't eat as much as those living in these sheltered kind of existences, especially if you're thinking about elaborate castles, like, you know, grandiose castles where very rich people are living, right? So we're representing a certain kind of people. A great topic to think about and write about when it comes to this story, I think. The neighbor's wife, she says, oh, the old model, it's still good enough for us, but based on her, the way she says it, longing, wistfulness, she seems like she's pretty upset by it, which is envy, right? How quick we are to envy, right? Everybody wants to go and see the new model. They are the talk of the town. They are keeping up with the Joneses and they are showing it off. They don't know what to do with that feeling though. It's strange to them, right? But Mike needs to go in first, all right? And when he does, and he completely seals himself off in this, and I'll just read a little bit here. Nothing else was wanted. He could reach out and touch whatever he needed. He could stay here forever, though through all time, without stirring, complete and entire, not lacking, not fearing. Right? This is the womb, right? A general yet powerful description of the womb and what it provides before you have any understanding of a world that lies beyond that, right? In this torrential world, right? That you are about to enter into. Total provisions, total security, right? And really, when you think of it this way, it makes you miss the womb, right? A place where everything was perfect, yet for a brief amount of time, right before life started. Not to say that life is not beautiful, but the trials and tribulations, and for some of us, the real devastation that life brings as well. Like a living container, living, the womb is living, right? Very nice. So I think that's a very solid symbol for us in this story, a solid metaphor. Now, it ends with him letting out a shout. He's so happy? I don't know. Weird, right? So happy he lets out this kind of roar of a shout, and it reverberates around all of the walls in this small bomb shelter, deep tucked underground here. And his voice comes across as hard and incredibly powerful. Now, two ways. On a mature kind of set of analysis, and I think there's something to it, it could be phallic imagery, right? That there is something as powerful, right, as that male genitalia in this kind of, in this state, right? This hard and incredibly powerful state. That could be it. We are going to try to, we get moving on with some description of weapons that are being produced, trying to get to the womb. Things trying to bore down. We even get words like impregnate, right? Impregnate. And it does make us think, and there's actually a perfect number that will make us think about this, the Immaculate Conception of Christ. The fact that there was no protrusion, there was no penetration in the conception, or whatever you want to call it, of Jesus Christ. And that's why he's so pure. That's why he is without corruption of that outside world, right? It's very similar to this bomb shelter and being completely cut off, right, from all this other stuff. It's fascinating. And it's what Philip K. Dick, I do really think, is after here. So that's one way of understanding that, is how powerful it is. The other is this. Think about how meek and quiet Mike is throughout so much of the story at school, as other students just kind of talk about him. At the bomb shelter, as he just tries to spend a little bit of time in solace in this bomb shelter, right, feeling safe and protected. He's a very meek and quiet kid. That is to be said of the wretched. That is to be said of the poor and the downtrodden, right? They accept their lot. They don't resist. They don't shout. Here, very importantly, he is hearing this might from himself for the very first time, right? And I think that's a good thing, because it's going to, it kind of connects again to Matthew 9:30 and the way Christ was talking to some of his followers, because they were bragging about the miracle. He had cured the two men's blindness, and the two men were bragging about the miracle of it to others, and Christ came down on that. He's like, don't brag about my miracles, right? They might happen and they exist, but you don't need to be like, ooh, look at this, look at how awesome this is, because that's just kind of the breeding grounds of greed and ego and pride, in the way we think about our lives, right? That sets us apart from others. So there's so much of that wonderful biblical themes, right? Those biblical themes that are working their way through here. So anyways, a very powerful end to that section. Moving on. He goes to school, and he feels a new peaceful confidence. Is that another example of oxymoronic language? Peaceful confidence, right? If you're ever confident, that's because you're always thinking about your ability versus other people, right? Confidence comes through you comparing yourself to other. Oh, I'm really good at this. All right, very good. I'm feeling great. Look at that person's taken forever. I just finished in 3 seconds. All right, excellent. So what peacefulness really comes from that, right? Maybe not a strong sense of peace, right? Not a very good sense of peace. All right, moving on here. The teacher, Mrs. Cummings, and this is the last I think we'll see of her, she just says, oh, I'm glad you got a bomb shelter. Now you like everybody else. And it's almost like this anticlimactic moment, right? Where it's, oh, great, yeah. Not that everyone's like, the neighbors were a bit in awe, but here at school, it's just like, finally, you've kind of stepped up to the level where everyone else is at, so great, right? The day moves on here, right? Not a big deal. You're just like everyone else. And it speaks to this eased conformity, right, that we have in our lives. All right, now we get some, this is weird, like just the name of these, next section, this is page 13. I'll have a link for this particular copy of the text below, if you're looking for one in general too. And this section we get news of and this could just be propaganda. It could be, I think we realize at this point, fake news, right? Meant to just keep people very afraid. And we have the Soviet bore pellets. And if you think about what a bore is, you can look this up on Google. It's like a shaft that just drills, like keeps going into the earth, right? Boring down as far as it can. And it really speaks to, I think, it's phallic, right? It almost speaks to the male genitalia as it kind of bears in, right? As it bores down, right? This is followed by, last week, it was grain impregnation flakes. So strange, right? What a crazy name for a weapon, grain impregnation flakes. Now, one thing is, like, just a crazy name gets us thinking crazy things. Maybe that's the fear of all of it. But I think there's a couple things you can actually pick apart here. Grain. We are talking about a story filled with allusions to wretched populations, poor, deprived, not having money to get by, not having money for food. And to bring up this word grain, bread, one of the most kind of nourishing crops the world has ever known. It's even in the Bible, right? The bread, the symbol, I think is a big thing, right? It just speaks to, like, the basic necessities for people, right? And what they require. Impregnation, there's that whole theme, that kind of thematic thread of conception, corruption, perhaps through the male genitalia. Then it makes us think, you're going to get this in the next section, I believe, Matthew 9:30, which ends up being kind of a reference. Also, I think one of these is to the Immaculate Conception of Christ, and Mary's role in all of that as a mother, right? That she was able to have that kind of defense from the outside world, including men. You think about where a lot of this corruption perhaps comes from, right? Maybe men. And to protect yourself from that, so that here we can have this pure child of hope and promise in the world that's going to do things differently, right, than the status quo. All right, so there's a lot of stuff that goes into this. Okay, very good. This is where Ruth, maybe quite objectively, likens weaponry and how it keeps being advanced and pushed to new limits as the wheels of progress. And that's very contradictory, because we usually don't think of wheels of progress. You think of wheels of progress, you think of, like, the ideas of Christ spreading throughout the world. You don't think of, ideas of, like, say, war, right, and trying to kill each other and harm each other in mass. You don't think of those ideas being likened to progress, but that's what they do here, right? I love this line. They're talking about this stuff, and then it says, the man and woman faced each other. What the hell are we going to do? Bob Foster asked quietly. I love how the man and woman faced each other, because it's almost like the potential bringing together of two bodies, which speaks to conception and life. But maybe it's that idea of protection. I'm not too sure. But I love how it's not father, mother, or Ruth, Bob and Ruth in that moment. It's man and woman, as if they are like these two vital forces within this world, right? All right, very good. All right, so this happens quickly. Some of the stuff that Bob was doing at school was berry identification. This is one of the activities that they were working on. And this is interesting because they got to see what are the harmful berries versus what are the non-toxic, non-harmful berries. And the good way to understand this is news. There is news that is essentially harmless. It's just there to inform on some kind of objective level, and we can make decisions for ourselves. Isn't that nice? Then there is harmful, toxic news. Whether you want to call it fake news or just misleading news, incomplete news, biased news, you call it what you need to, but there is news that is led to mislead us, right, and lead us astray or make us feel a certain way in the intentions of those who create those particular news, who run those news stations, right? So just keep that in mind, right? So by looking at these berries and trying to see what's harmless, what's not, it's really about sifting through information, and that is very difficult, very difficult. That's why I love this story. He's predicting back in the 1960s, 70s, whenever this was published, the kinds of issues that we would be running in nowadays, right? Having to sift through information to even see what's real, deep fakes, right? All this stuff, it's enough to make your head spin, right? We're really living it at this point in time. All right, very good. It says right here, the bore pellets were specifically designed to penetrate the surface and seek out warmth, right? So to bore down and find those bomb shelters where there seems to be this warmth and life And we see that with Mike, right? Especially the last time he was in there, he seemed to be a good representation of a brimming life, right? To the point where he shouts as a kind of testament to his life, right? But notice the penetration, right? There's the idea, I think, of the male genitalia seeking to penetrate and corrupt, right? Bob Foster, you know, he gives in completely. He's already bought this bomb shelter, and now there's these. So he's going to buy the adapter, and he says, "I'll never stop buying." And the question we have here is, how did the father get to this point, right? Going from an anti-P to now he'll never stop buying a thing that these companies put out in way of defense. The dad finds in this moment to continue to kind of critique the whole business mindset, especially in terms of marketing and advertising. And I'll just read this. They always said the way to sell something was create anxiety in people, create a sense of insecurity, tell them they smell bad or look funny. But now this is buy or die. That's the new slogan, right? Because now you need this for your own protection based on the propaganda that is being purported by all of the news agencies in this society, right? So we go right into the next section here. Some oxymoronic description. It's kind of laced throughout this story of the Christmas crowds. And, quote, shoving good-naturedly, loaded down with packages and heavy overcoats, unquote. Shoving good-naturedly, we wonder if that is even possible. If you're shoving, you're already in a state of mind, usually something competitive, you know, shoving for a place in line, shoving for food, who knows. So there's already a sense of competition in place. How in the world could that be good-natured, right? Or has what it means to be good-natured really just become a shoving match, and we don't even know what it means to be good-natured any longer? Notice how we really deeply kind of read into any of the oxymoronic instances that we see here, right? Business is not going good for the family. We find out the boy comes home, he puts away his school books. To put away the school books, I think, is to put away the propaganda, right? And that's important because now you're home. You're now in the domain of your father and mother, especially the father, who has a different sense of things. He's not just going to spit out the same propaganda that you're receiving at school. And I love that. I can't even say I was really thinking about that theme before reading this story and spending more time with it with students, is that home becomes a place where you can think for yourself and share those ideas that you are truly impassioned about, right? Whereas out there, you're surrounded, right? And some of us can't share what we want to share or think what we want to think. It's a very powerful idea. Mike cannot wait to get down into the bomb shelter. We find out he has this routine that, you know, every day he gets home from school, he'll quickly kind of, walk through his house, and then he just wants to get to the backyard where he sees the bomb shelter, lifting the entrance, lifting out always like a neck. And I think that's food. We just have the grain, bread, right? It's just this idea of being hungry, right? And having something to fill that empty belly, and to not have to live in such a state of wretchedness, right? Forever and ever and ever. His procedure had been shaped, molded until it was a beautiful thing. It just feels phallic there, but I'll just kind of leave that one behind, right? But it's just this whole preparation for this moment. And the grandeur of the shelter itself. And grandeur's a frightening word because it speaks to abundance, what he longs for based on the society that he lives in and the kind of examples and models that are on display. But, you know, it doesn't speak well to a minimal kind of life. When you think of Christ-like characteristics, the idea of the grandeur of the shelter, I don't think is such a great idea. And another reference we get here, and this is a massive reference, and I don't want to take too much time. I'm going to go through it kind of quick. But we get one allusion here, The Wind in the Willows. And this is an older children's novel, and it really incorporates so many important themes that we can then apply to this story. And I'm just going to mention them quickly. I wrote these down from a website because I've never read Wind in the Willows, but the themes are so impressive. Here they are. 1, friendship and mentorship. And when we think of friendship and mentorship in this story, the characters that come to mind is dad, perhaps the mom to a certain degree, and definitely the president, right? The president as a mentor in some sense to Mike, who barely knows the guy and only has this story that of his dad who ran into this guy and talked to him. But more importantly, the dad is that mentor, right? Let me tell you how these advertisers work. Let me tell you how all of this has gone down. Let me show you how phony it all is. But Mike maybe not really taking to that message too much in the home. Another big topic theme for this is manners and conduct of being in a society. In this society, you pay into the Nats, you pay into the civic defense, right, etc. There's certain rules that everyone should be following, but not Mike's father, and therefore, as an anti-P, they are, I wouldn't say ostracized, but shunned, right, and very much ridiculed, right, openly within this society. So manners and conduct. Number 3, another good one, nature, leisure, and the modern world, right? The modern world is the need for bomb shelters, right? The AI that's incorporating itself in furniture. Leisure is like, the grandeur of the shelter. Not only does it have all the food you would ever need, but all the entertainment you would ever need. You are set for life to live some very comfortable existence. Similar to the womb, when all of that is on its most basic levels, but it's all being provided by the mother, right? All being provided by mom, who plays such a crucial role in all of that. Number 4, home, identity, and adventure. I love that. When Mike is in the house, he can hear his father speak. There's a warmth there. Mike can share how he feels, as opposed to everywhere else where you're just kind of stricken by propaganda, right? And there's not much wiggle room. The last one, obviously essential, greed, arrogance, and social class. We see this when the family comes and the neighbors come and pay their visit. So the arrogance, the social class here. You see this at the end too, with Al Connors, one of the GE employees. He seems to really only care about money, profit, advancement, right? So this is interesting. This is Wind of the Willows. And this is what Mike is reading. He's listening to the audio tapes. And he goes down into the bomb shelter by himself every day, locks himself away and listens, which is essentially reflecting upon these important themes, right? And I love that allusion because you learn so much from them in terms of big ideas for this story. I think some of my students found that very helpful, giving them ideas of what to write about. He goes back to the backyard. It's gone. A quote unquote, a vast yawning cavity loomed, an emptiness. And it almost feels like an empty mouth. It could be an empty womb. That could be one way of looking at it. But for me, because we get the neck, the tube going down, the descent lift is a neck, it just feels like food. And now with bomb shelter taken away, the food has been taken out of the belly, right? Just like the bread. And it kind of takes us back to that, the state of not a kid living in a science fiction story who's got some stuff in life, can't afford a bomb shelter, whatever, but it takes us back to the wretched populations of this world now and in the past who can't even have the bread, right, to speak of. Think about that, right? But an emptiness here. Mike gets violent. I think we start to see a real reaction against this, right? He's had this protection. It's been taken away. He had that grandeur. Maybe that was more important for him. It's been taken away. He starts to get very angry and violent, right? The dad says, I couldn't afford it, right? Not with everybody buying those adapter grills, right, for their bomb shelters. It was either give up the store or give up the bomb shelter, and if I had to give up the store, we wouldn't have a bomb shelter, right? So I had to make a tough decision there. He says, this isn't a matter of principle, it comes down to money. And that's where that theme becomes powerful, right? The haves and the have-nots. Some people can afford everything they need. Some people just merely can't. And they strive to and they can't. It's tough. It's tough. It's a very real situation for a lot of people. Mike seems, runs away. His dad tries to catch him and slams his head, whatever. Mike runs away. And it's just this feeling of exhaustion at the end. Last scene. This is we're back at the GE Appliance Center with the bomb shelter, right? This is it. We got Bill O'Neill. And remember O'Neill, I haven't said this yet. O'Neill translates to champion. And I think in at least maybe a little bit, maybe a moderate amount, he will be the champion for Mike here at the end. Mike needs a champion. He's got his dad at home, but maybe he needs something else. It's 9:30. All right, 9:30 at night, they're closing up the shop. 9:30, I looked this up, I think it was very helpful. This was a reference to the biblical passage, Matthew 9:30. And Matthew basically, as New Testament, tells the story of Christ. Like, it's all about the story of Christ. And this refers to a harshness in Christ's message to refrain from ostentation. And ostentation is like bragging and boasting, right? In his own miracles. Like I said, he cured 2 men of blindness, but instead of those men just accepting that miracle and being humble about it, they go off and they brag about it. Did you hear about Jesus Christ? And you go, oh, can you believe it? Us. And they make this big deal about it, and he's upset about that to the point of anger. You can see how much this means to him. And also the idea of vainglory, right? Which is excessive pride in our lives, our achievements, right? Notice that very much factors into the getting of the bomb shelter, feeling like we belong, people envy us, right? Living in that vainglory, right? Okay, it has obvious links to consumerism. We buy things, we show off. People buy things, they go on YouTube, they got their own channels, they unbox things, they show off these things, we become envious. It really is overwhelming, right, when you start to think about it. So there's heavy links to consumerism when it comes to vainglory, which is inordinate pride and excessive vanity. Bill O'Neill is closing the store and he says, thank God. He breathed. Breathed, contrast to strangulation, right? Maybe when I read this last night yesterday when I was preparing, breathing is not worrying about having to be so prideful and boastful about everything, right? That's what brings that sense of strangulation to our lives, is when we feel like we do have to express all these things about ourselves, right? That's endless. Here, with the closing of the store, you don't have to sell anything. You can breathe again. And he says, thank God, because God is opposed to all of those notions of competition, business acumen, getting ahead, being the best. It all nullifies with Christ, right? So thank God, yes, literally, we have closed this store, right? I like how Phil K, he does that a lot in his stories. He uses it as exclamation, but it actually has a very literal kind of application. Moving on, here comes Al Connors. Al Connors seems to be the foil to Bill O'Neill. Bill O'Neill is champion. Connors is, if you look up Connors, master of hounds or wolves. So it speaks to a very predatorial part of who we are, right? Almost obviously on an animal level. And Al is dealing with the money, and all he cares about is the money, closing the store, getting everybody out, right? But he's obviously worried about the money. I like how O'Neill loosens the tie. To loosen the tie is to get out of that business mindset, and you can start looking at people not as customers, but as human beings, right? Who have all kinds of needs. He lights a cigarette gratefully. Gratefully has obvious religious connotations here. Don't smoke, it's bad for you. But yeah, you see the level of almost divinity coming in here in this moment of closing down the store, right? He goes into the cave-like interior of the shelter. And I think that almost reminds us of like ancient days, you know, taking us back to like the ancient days of Christ, perhaps, right? In those time periods, in the state of poverty and misery, you'd find people in caves, right? Living who knows what kind of lives. Also, we keep up the idea of a womb. Here we find Mike, his knees drawn up against his chin, his skinny arms wrapped around his ankles. It's hard not to get that impression of a fetus in your mind. Only his ragged brown hair showed. First time we've gotten any color on his hair. And I think brown ties us to gophers, right? This idea of digging to find what you're in search of. In this case, safety and salvation, and maybe even salvation, right? Jesus, O'Neill exclaimed, it's that kid. And that might be taken at face value. This kid is a representation. Maybe not Jesus per se, maybe, but a representation of Christ. This could be Jesus in the womb, Immaculate Conception of Mary, right? It very well could be that case, right? It's amazing. All right, very good. Moving on here. He buries his head as far down as possible in his knees and his arms. There's that idea of the gopher, right? Burying as far down as we can. In this sense, he has nowhere to go but his own body, right? Which shows you how desperate Mike is. I don't know how much of a happy ending this is, to be honest, as we get to the last 2 pages. He's in a very defeated state here. And let's see what O'Neill can do. Come on, kid, O'Neill said gently. So we do get this gentleness from him, right? And now they got to drag him out. And the dragging is very interesting. right? The dragging reminds me, and I could be off on this, but the dragging of Christ to the crucifixion, right? Almost by the Roman soldiers, right? That's what it feels like a little bit. But they get him up there grimly, efficiently, maybe the last, maybe not even oxymoronic, but it feels that way. Because if you're being efficient, why does it feel grim? But there is some grim efficiency. Look at the Holocaust. I mean, there's one example, right? Look at the Holocaust. That was some grim efficiency right there. So it makes you think about, with this rationalistic kind of mindset, right, where it's just about customers or seeing you like a student, and we're not seeing people as people any longer, human beings in need of some kind of compassion and consideration. What becomes of our outlook on people? What can that do to society? Right? Scary to think. All right, they bundle up the boy almost like he's an appliance. Remember, we talk about people being treated more like robots, right? More like machinery. And we get that here as they throw him out onto the street. This is a big part of it. There's something, Al Connor says, there's something wrong with that kid. And it's one of those moments where the irony is so thick, you just turn it back around. We know that, yeah, there's things wrong with this kid. He's scared. He is defeated, etc. But why is he that way? Because something's wrong with society. Right, there's what it is. It's not that there's something wrong with this kid. We reflect there's something wrong with society, and what are those things?
Are you almost done?
Almost done, yeah. So,
how many more minutes?
like 5.
Because I want to get going shopping.
Okay. All right. There's been a lot of like shaking. You see characters like their hands shaking. I think that just speaks to a general fear, right? Whatever. Connor says it. Listen, we can't give this kid something for nothing. No ticky, no laundry, which means no money, no business, right? No money, no product, no money, no service. And that speaks to that business mindset, right? And that seems to prevail here at the end, unfortunately, right? It really does seem to prevail. Moving on here, even says maybe O'Neill is the champion in the sense that he's trying to find a way to help this kid who doesn't have the money. His parents don't have the money to buy the shelter. And he's like, can we buy it wholesale? And wholesale, remember, you buy something wholesale, that's what the business is getting it straight from the manufacturer. And that can be for a lot less money than what they sell at retail once it gets in their store and they mark up the prices, right? So it speaks to a more compassionate way of doing business. Notice Costco kind of does this, Costco wholesale. So you go there, you have to buy more of something, but you get the prices more or less that they're getting from the people that they get from, right? Whereas other stores, it's not like that. They're marking it up quite a bit. So it speaks to a more compassionate way of doing business, but from a business-minded person, that's how you're going to go out of business, right? Is when you stop generating increasing profits, right? But profit is lost somewhere else. So if a company is profiting, that means it's lost for somebody else. It could be customers, it could be workers, it could be all kinds of people. But back to this, we're almost there. Notice Connor says it. Use your head. And that's the problem. We're not using our hearts. We're just using our heads, right? Not only in the world of business, but perhaps everywhere for that matter, right? We're just using our head. We get a reference to Hague. It's a liquor. But it also, if you look up Hague, it means enclosure. And it means keeping people out. Notice that's what they just did. Around the store, they just kicked out Mike and they built an enclosure. You can't come in. And it reminds me of a couple things. One thing it reminds me of is Ireland, right? Where they started kicking poor peasants and rural farmers off the land. Even English people going into, I think that's what Moon was, English royalty and rich people were going into Ireland, enclosing the lands and kicking people off these large pieces of land for like using it for golf courses and this and that. And so that's what you're doing. You're just blocking off, right? Hague is a enclosure of hedges. So you're blocking things off. Now this is all mine. It also makes me think of like I live in one, gated communities, right? Where we find the need to enclose and block off. And why do we do this? It's not just to have a beautiful wall and a gate around a neighborhood. It's to keep people out that you don't want. I like the idea you can keep solicitors out, people trying to sell you stuff, but I'm not naive to think there's not another notion to that too, right? Just keeping common people who are on the regular streets out of these neighborhoods, right? All right. So Mike just walks down the street. There's one man who stops and like tries to pay a little consideration from him, but that's short-lived. And Mike walks off. It's last lines for him, quote unquote. He walked automatically without consciousness or feeling. And we end with this advertisement on a public bomb shelter. It reads, "Peace on earth, goodwill to men. Public shelter admission 50 cents. There's a lot of contradiction tied up in these last couple lines. Peace on earth, goodwill to men. Just the whole notion of that speaks to such a positivity that is deflected by the idea that there is need for a bomb shelter in the first place, right? That countries are supposedly, though that never comes to fruition, there's the doubt of it, but that we are hell-bent on destroying each other. That's not peace on earth, and that's not goodwill to men, right? So it kind of speaks to a world that is not really being broadcasted on at that time. And then public shelter admission 50% or 50 cents, public should be free, right? And we talk about that with healthcare. We talk about that. You go back with public schools and way back when they were free, right? The whole idea was public was free so that normal people could get ahead in life. And it's not just a world for the rich to continue this cycle of the rich stay rich or get richer, right? So why are we charging for this? I think that's one of the ironies as well, right? And also the idea, how can there be any peace on earth, any goodwill, if we just have something based on money, right? You think about Jesus kicking out in anger, I believe, the moneylenders, right? And trying to remind people that if you are bound to money, you are bound to some other persuasion and not God's persuasion, right? At least from that state of mind, that perspective. You are bound to something else, something more corruptible as soon as you are bound to money. And that could be one of the deeper ideas here as well. Thank you. I know there was a lot to say about the story. Incredibly relevant. I hope you get a chance to read it again, but really appreciate your time in putting this together.